Welcome to Functional Philosophy, the show in which I, Charles II, explain and apply Ayn Rand's philosophy, Objectivism. If you'd like to ask me a question on Objectivism or its application, just go to charles2.com/contact. And my last name is spelled T as in Tango, E as in Echo, and W as in Whiskey. Today's question starts with a quote from Ayn Rand's journals. Quote, "A perfect, clear understanding also means a feeling. It isn't enough to realize a thing is true. The realization must be so clear that one feels this truth, for men act on feelings, not on thoughts. Every thought should be part of yourself, your body, your nature, and every part of your nature should be a thought. Every feeling, a thought. Every thought, a feeling." End quote. Now the questioner adds, "What I take this to mean is that it is a germ of Rand's more fully developed concept that ideally man is an integrated being of thought, feeling, and action. In fact, that a healthy human being experiences no contradiction between his thoughts, his emotions, and his actions. Further, I take from this that though it is one's volitional consciousness that selects one's goals and purposes and one's direction, it is one's emotions, hopefully one's passions, that fuel the actions one takes to achieve one's purposes. If our premises are true, then our passions drive us to our goals. Please comment." Well, please comment is an open-ended request, so I will comment on a few things. First, about what you, the questioner, said. I found it confusing. It's ungrammatical, and the logic between sentences isn't clear. So I broke my brain going over this, trying to come up with a coherent response, and I couldn't come up with one because I don't know what you're saying. I can't give a logical response to something illogical. For instance, taking your last two sentences. The first is overlong, which makes it difficult to hold in mind, but if I paraphrase it, it's our volitional consciousness selects our goals, and then the sentence after that is, if our premises are true, then our passions drive us to our goals. Why would our emotions driving us toward our goals depend on our premises being true? Well, you could say they depend on our premises about our means being true, which is true, but that's not what you're talking about. The last sentence specifically talks about goals. You could have a false premise about what your goal should be, and your premise will still drive you toward that goal if your premise is that that is your goal and should be. So I don't know what you're trying to say here. I also just can't resist commenting on the sloppy grammar, which means sloppy thinking. You say, what I take this to mean is that it is a germ of Rand's more fully developed concept, and so on. What you should have said is, what I take this to mean is that man is an integrated being of thought, and so on. Or, I take this to be a germ of Rand's more fully developed concept, and so on. But you say, what I take this to mean is that it is a germ of Rand's more fully developed concept? That is just sloppy grammar. Now, there are other grammatical mistakes in here. Misplaced commas that corrupt the logical flow of sentences, and as I said, a lack of logical connection between sentences. Now, I don't say all this to be pedantic, nor am I trying to pick on this particular questioner. I could do this with virtually every question I get. And the reason I occasionally do it is because it is important to think clearly. Grammar does not consist of a bunch of arbitrary rules that we adopt out of social convention. You think in words. Writing something out in words is not a secondary act. It's not something you do after you've had a thought. It is the thought. You can't say, well, I understand this idea, I just presented it poorly. No. What you presented was what you thought. If you said it poorly, you thought it poorly. If you wrote it poorly, you thought it poorly. Writing is something you do for yourself first and foremost. Actually, speaking of Ayn Rand's journals, I think she wrote something in there about Austin Heller from The Fountainhead. I think this was in her notes on him. But in any case, somewhere Ayn Rand expressed the idea that writing something down is a solitary action. It is primarily for you. Even if the second after you write something down, it evaporates, the act was worth it. It was necessary. Because getting something out in explicit verbal terms makes it objective. This is why I speak out loud all the time. Whenever I'm thinking about something serious, I actually speak all of my thoughts out loud. Because if you don't do that, you take all kinds of shortcuts and tolerate all kinds of fuzziness in your own mind. If you're not used to speaking out loud when you're thinking about difficult ideas, try it. You will be amazed at how clear it forces you to be. Anyway, all of this just to say your writing is a manifestation of your thinking. And there is nothing more important than thinking clearly. Also, it's clear that this questioner is an older person because he double spaces after the end of every sentence, which, since we don't use typewriters anymore, is pointless and ugly. And again, I don't mean to pick on this questioner, but every once in a while, an example must be made. As I said, I don't keep notes about the questions I receive, so I have no idea who sent this question, so my criticisms are nothing personal. But now, about Ayn Rand's quote from the journals. What do I think about that? Well, I agree with it entirely. Men do act on feelings, and not on thoughts directly. The whole point of feelings is to motivate action. In fact, think about what a motivation is. A motivation is a feeling. Now you might say, oh, I felt motivated by this idea or this fact, but those ideas and facts, or recognitions of fact, produce feelings, and the feelings are the motivation. The feelings are the motive power. Think about why feelings are there. Are they just there for no reason? Are they just epiphenomenal? It's just, well, it's a good thing we have feelings, but they're not necessary? No, they are there because there's no reason to do anything without feelings. If there were only thought and action, you would never take any action. You might think, oh yes, I see, yes, I have to go and gather food so I can eat and I don't starve to death. Oh, I should get out of the middle of the road so this car doesn't run over me. Without feelings, you could recognize that, but you would take no action. You wouldn't feel fear, you wouldn't feel anticipation for the pleasures and joys you will attain in the future by surviving now, or by the very act of survival. You just wouldn't do anything. There would be no reason to do anything. So yes, men do act on feelings. Now Ayn Rand says it isn't enough to realize a thing is true. The realization must be so clear that one feels this truth. Well, again, this is exactly right. For the reasons I just explained, there's no point in recognizing that something is true if it isn't going to motivate your actions. So what Ayn Rand is saying here is, don't just accept certain ideas as true, even if you really understand them in some form. That's not good enough. That's not the point of truth. It's not just to know it. It's to motivate your actions. And so you shouldn't stop until you have such a clear grasp of an idea that it actually makes a difference to you emotionally and therefore existentially. Now think about this. What would it mean to realize something is true, but without enough clarity to motivate your action? Well, people do this with objectivism itself all the time. I would go so far as to say the vast majority of people who call themselves objectivists hold the philosophy as a cognitive construct. It's something that they accept cognitively. They think on those premises, but it doesn't actually motivate their action in real life. They can talk all day long about the virtues, for instance, but they go on faking reality in a million ways every day. That is what it means to realize a thing is true, but not clearly enough. Now, I do want to head off a mistake that people might make after hearing this, and many people have made. None of this is to say that temptation is immoral. When we say you should have a perfect integration of mind and body, that does not mean that you are omniscient or that you have everything in focal awareness all the time. That is impossible. Sometimes you will simply be caught off guard by something. So you're on a diet, but you see a piece of cake, and you feel desire for it. That is not immoral. That does not mean that you don't have a perfect integration. The standard of perfect is what is possible for a human being, and it is not possible to have all of your ideas about what you should be eating in your mind all the time. What morality requires in that case is to not simply go with your unexamined emotions and eat the cake, but to think about whether you should. Howard Rourke experiences temptation. John Galt experiences temptation. Ayn Rand's ideal men experience temptation. If you feel guilt at the experience of temptation, then know that it is unearned, and you should adopt the correct premises to get rid of it. Namely, a rational, realistic standard about what's possible to a human being given the identity of our minds. Next, what is the difference between controlling emotion versus suppressing/repressing emotion? Well, first let's define suppression versus repression. Repression is when you don't feel an emotion at all. I'm not a psychologist, I don't know exactly what causes this, but it obviously has something to do with a judgment reached subconsciously that emotions are dangerous. Children with emotionalist parents often suffer from repression. Ayn Rand points this out in the Comprachicos, I think. Children see their parents acting unpredictably and destructively as a result of their emotionalism, and the children come to the conclusion, emotions are dangerous. Don't be like that. Clamp down on emotions. And so that kind of mistake can lead to repression, can lead to suppressing emotions so dramatically that you cease to feel them at all. So you don't have to suppress them anymore. They just don't come up. They're not generated. Now, suppressing I take to be ignoring an emotion by willpower. Now you say, how does this compare to controlling emotion? Well, I take you to use controlling emotion to refer to a rational approach to dealing with your emotions. So how do you rationally handle your emotions versus suppressing them? Well, I first wouldn't say that suppression is always wrong. There may be some emergency situations where you simply have to do that momentarily. I'm not certain about this, but I don't want to condemn it in all cases without having thought it through. But in any case, usually the correct approach is not simply to ignore your emotions by focusing on something else, but to confront them directly. Let yourself feel the emotion. Focus on the fact that you're feeling it. Identify it verbally. Identify what it means, what its action implications are, what ideas are causing it. And then, if the action implications are wrong, think about why, and that will generate a counteracting emotion, which you can then choose to follow without ignoring the original emotion. Now let's concretize this. Let's say you are treated horribly unjustly at work by your boss, and you feel rage. Well, repression would be not feeling the rage at all. Suppression would be thinking about what you should do and doing that without confronting the emotion. Now, rationally controlling your emotion would be recognizing that you feel like punching your boss in the face because you were treated unjustly, focusing on that fact, and then thinking about whether you should do that, and if you come to the conclusion that you shouldn't, focusing on the resulting emotion that will allow you to take the action of walking away or telling your boss what you need to tell him, just being verbal instead of physical, whatever. Now, I'm not saying that thinking in this way will immediately generate an emotion that will overwhelm your rage, but it will generate a possible alternative, another emotion that you can choose to follow. In fact, this is one way that you can characterize what separates man from the animals. Human beings can generate their own emotions. Animals simply act on what they feel. Animals live an effortless existence. Not in the sense that they don't use their muscles, but they never exert mental effort because they don't think. They just feel and they act on their feelings. They are in a constant flow state. Human beings, however, through mental effort, through thought, can generate countervailing emotions and choose to go with those instead. Now, this isn't actually the essence of what separates man from the animals, but it is one of the major consequences of the actual fundamental, essential difference, which I won't go into here, but will in my book after the one I'm writing now. I also want to point out that rationally handling your emotion involves confronting that emotion. Notice that in suppressing your emotion, you are still thinking about what you should do and generating a countervailing emotion, but you aren't confronting the original emotion. That is what makes it suppression, and in most cases, except for possibly some emergency scenarios, evasion. If you don't confront the emotion, the offending emotion, it won't go away. And the reason for this is that even though you are generating a new, true premise, you aren't uprooting the old one, which is a critical step in the process of changing your psychology. You cannot simply come up with a new idea. You have to get rid of the old one. But getting rid of the old one means confronting it. It means identifying it and thinking about why it's wrong, not just why your new premise is true. So I have found that the best way to deal with intolerable emotions, such as agonizing envy, you just can't stand the fact that some people are born with $1 million trust funds or something. This is a common feeling even for many objectivists, and they find that they can't get rid of it. They still feel this way even once they adopt objectivist premises, even once they have proven to themselves that selfishness is true and good and means you shouldn't care about things like that. They still feel the envy. Well, the solution to this is to let that deluge of envy wash over you. Bathe in it. Confront it head on. Feel it fully in the rawest form possible. Identify it verbally, explicitly, and let yourself feel it. Now, if you do that in conjunction with attaining a clear understanding of why what those feelings imply is wrong, again, as Ayn Rand said in the quotation in the last question, you must have a clear understanding. But if you let yourself experience these raw emotions and identify them intellectually in conjunction with proving to yourself why some contradictory premise is true, then you will find that you will actually be unable to maintain that former emotion. You actually won't be able to be bothered by other people being born rich or whatever it is that was bothering you that you know is wrong. And the reason is that now you have uprooted the cause of that emotion. You haven't just adopted a new truth. You have shown yourself why that old truth isn't actually truth. It's false. You can't just adopt a new truth. Now you have two truths until you go back and see that the old one is actually false. Many people simply attempt to adopt new ideas and never uproot the old ones, which is why you have all of these objectivists running around with emotions that are contrary to what you would expect from someone who believes in the principles of objectivism. Next, I have combined 3 questions here, all from the same person over time, because they are all essentially the same, but each one emphasizes a different mistaken premise more clearly than the others. So first, if objectivism is inevitably going to dominate the culture, why will it take going through a dark ages before it is rediscovered? Isn't it more likely for it to happen now when we have free speech and the internet? Second of these questions, if Thomas Aquinas could single-handedly bring man out of the dark ages through reintroducing Aristotle, why couldn't Ayn Rand bring us out of our present philosophical Deadpool of nihilism and decay? We have complete free speech and the internet. How is it possible we are still losing? Third of these questions. Once objectivism takes hold, will it be irreversible? It provides too many correct answers for another Immanual Kant type to undo. Okay. First, I just want to point out that this use of Deadpool is, of course, wrong. You mean something like cesspit. A Deadpool is a game in which people bet on when someone will die. Don't use words you don't understand. Don't just go by feeling. Yeah, I kind of have a feel for what this word means. No, look it up. Alright. Now there are 2 very wrong premises I want to focus on. First, this questioner claims we have complete free speech and the internet, he says. We do not have complete free speech. First of all, we certainly don't have free speech regarding Islam. Now, yes, many people don't criticize Islam out of anti-Western nihilism or social cowardice, but many people don't criticize Islam out of fear for their physical safety. That is not free speech. Now, you may say that this is not the government stopping people from criticizing Islam, but it is, in fact, the government stopping people from criticizing Islam. The essence of censorship is that it is force. It is suppression of speech by force. Now, the reason we say only the government can do this is because a government holds the monopoly on force in a given area. Now, with regard to Islam, there are 2 possibilities. Either the government can't protect its citizens from reprisal when they criticize Islam, in which case, to that extent, it isn't the government, because it can't enforce its own laws. Or, what is actually the case in our case, the government refuses to protect the rights of its citizens to criticize Islam, in which case Muslim terrorists are acting as tacit agents of the government, which they are. So that is the most obvious way in which we don't have free speech today. Now, the second area we don't have free speech in is in the realm of anything politically correct. If you call trans people, being generous with that term, nihilistic freaks, then you will be kicked off of every social media platform, money-making platform, etc., if you're popular enough. Now, yes, these are private companies, kind of, but that's exactly the problem. They are kind of private companies. We don't have the freedom to engage with the competition that would exist if not for government intervention. Now, yes, it's true, Twitter has the right to make whatever rules it wants, but everyone else has the right to deal with other companies on terms of freedom. But that right is being suppressed. So now we are in an impossible conflict. Now, of course, the answer is not, as the fascist conservatives say, to regulate mass communication. It is to deregulate. But nonetheless, until we do deregulate, the fact remains that our right to free speech is being suppressed indirectly through massive government intervention into the economy. Now, Ayn Rand noted this herself in her time. She pointed out how intellectual and property rights were in fact one. You can't have intellectual freedom without property rights. She pointed out how government regulation entrenched certain newspapers, and now there were high barriers to entry for competitors, and in that way, free speech was limited. Now we have that situation today, combined with a nihilistic ideology in force among all of the major companies that have been entrenched by the government. So yes, Twitter should be able to ban you, Facebook should be able to ban you, YouTube should be able to kick you off, Patreon should be able to kick you off, credit card companies should be able to refuse to deal with you, and people should be able to call for your firing and financial ruin, all because you think it is a contradiction in terms to talk about a woman with a penis. However, you have the right to deal with the rational companies who would not fire someone for such views, which you do not have today, and as a result of government intervention. Now, this is not even to mention all of the ways censorship is occurring that can never be identified with specificity. All the ways that companies are firing people, not hiring them, that communication companies are creating their rules based on implications from people in power. Oh, this congressman wrote a letter. He wouldn't like this. Now, it's just a letter. He's not passing a law, but of course he has the power to influence laws. So there are just a million ways, once the government has power, its suggestions, its preferences carry weight. A weight they wouldn't have if we had objective laws, but we don't have that anymore. The government can do essentially whatever it wants. That is what the Supreme Court has been saying more and more emphatically over time. With the passage of Obamacare, even the most tenuous and arbitrary limitation on the government's power was removed, so long as the government is willing to call whatever it's doing a tax. Now, how does all of this relate to our cultural prospects? Well, you might note that the areas in which we don't have free speech are precisely those areas that pose the biggest threat to Western society: Islam and leftist nihilism. Now, Islam is not a military threat. It wouldn't be if we had the moral courage to deal with it anyway. But in terms of what could be considered military threats, it is number one. Islam is our greatest material threat, specifically those states that adhere to Islam. If we don't deal with them, they will eventually get nukes, and they will use them against us. But it is precisely the ideology motivating these actions that we are not allowed to criticize. And outside of the military realm, culturally speaking, the biggest threat to the West is leftist nihilism. And again, that is precisely what we are not allowed to criticize. So in both matter and spirit, what we are not allowed to talk about are precisely those things that most urgently require discussion. Now, if you are waiting for Congress to pass and President Trump to sign into law the American Censorship Act of 2019 before you are willing to say that we have censorship, then I'm afraid you will not recognize censorship when it comes, because that is not how it works. It is not binary. It is a creeping thing. It grows by degrees, and it already exists to a significant extent in the US, and I haven't even talked about the rest of the world. There is no such thing as free speech in other Western countries. Not even theoretically, not even in the law. So you can forget them, and then you can forget even more non-Western countries. Now, the other major mistake here is the idea that progress is deterministic. The questioner says, quote, if objectivism is inevitably going to dominate the culture, unquote, and, quote, once objectivism takes hold, will it be irreversible, unquote. Well, objectivism is not inevitably going to dominate the culture, and it will not be irreversible if it ever does. Now, it is true that truth beats falsehood if enough people are championing the truth. Now, the truth will win in such circumstances, even if it is a minority position. It can be at a significant numerical disadvantage, and it will still win. But nonetheless, there have to be enough champions of truth for it to win. This is why you can be benevolent, but not believe in deterministic progress. Yes, the truth wins if people champion it, but there's no guarantee that people will. Well, then you might say, well, maybe it will take a long time, but if we don't go extinct, which is not something you can be sure of, if we slide back now, for instance, we're sliding back with nuclear weapons, so the entire human race could be wiped out. But even if we get rid of this problem of the idea that objectivism is inevitably going to dominate the culture, if it does, how could we ever slide back? Because the truth wins, right? And people know it. Wrong. The philosophers will know it. The people won't. The majority of people will never understand the details of concept formation. And that is not a fault of theirs. That's simply a result of the fact that human life requires people to erect steel girders and create skyscrapers, as well as contemplate the fundamental nature of reason. So even if we got to a point where the philosophical mainstream was objectivist, that is not a perpetual motion device. If those who understand the truth slack off in their job of communicating it to the public, while evil people, evil thinkers, take action and spread bad ideas, then we can regress even from an objectivist paradise. We had all of the correct fundamentals during the Enlightenment, but we slipped back from that. Now, this is in part because the people with better ideas couldn't fully defend them against people like Kant, but even if they could, if they had failed to communicate why their ideas were right as against Kant's, but Kant succeeded in communicating his ideas to the public, then Kant would have won. The majority matters. It will determine the nature of a society, but it is the philosophers who determine the nature of the majority. The battle for the world takes place fundamentally between a handful of people, philosophers at the highest level. So while it is true that the truth wins, the public will never consist of full-time philosophers, which is a good thing because it means I will always have a job. And my job is to communicate the right ideas to non-philosophers. Now, I will win so long as I'm right and the other guys are wrong, but if I don't do the job, I lose. So that's the situation here. You can't drop the context of the public versus the intellectuals. Since the public will never be a public of philosophers, it will always be necessary for the philosophers who understand the truth to communicate that truth to the public. So while a philosopher may understand why reason is valid all the way down, if he doesn't help the layman understand that, but some Kantian goes around offering specious arguments, then the layman may adopt some Kantian view, even though the philosopher knows better. So good ideas will beat bad ideas, but there is also an issue of depth. The public will never have the full depth of these ideas, and so they will never be invulnerable to corruption, which is why people who understand the truth must be vigilant. If you'd like to keep up with everything I do, just go to charles2.com. If you'd like to enable me to do more, just go to patreon.com/Charles2 and become a supporter. Thanks for listening.